Hello, in this video we're going to look at how to modify our character mesh and materials based on item equips in Unreal Engine. So we're going to be tying this with our inventory system so that when we equip an item, we then also modify the way that that character looks. So in this case, we need to have some modular characters. I'm using assets from the Enhanced Studios, but it will work with other ones as well. And basically, what it means is that the character itself is customizable. So different components within the character, we can change the appearance, and we're going to do so based on the items that we equip. Perhaps the easiest way to look at this is through an example. So let's get into a quick demo. So let's have a quick look into the demo. So I've got my server up and running. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to log into one of my characters. And as you can see, I've already got a sword equipped. So I can unequip that sword, so I can double click it. It removes the sword from the inventory. It removes the sword from my character mesh. I can also equip a helmet. You can see the helmet goes onto the head. It's also even removing the hair because that would actually get in our way if I didn't. And yeah, this is fully functional. So do bear in mind, I haven't actually implemented the other items at the moment, but what I've done is I've put a system in place, and I'll just follow the same pattern for the other items, and you'll be able to sort of see that as we go through the code. So yeah, let's get started looking into what it is that we're building. So before going directly into code, I do want to look into the hierarchy of classes that we're going to be creating. So I do want to create this tree structure of items so that we can reuse the blueprints that we create. So for instance, I'm going to have a base class, which is going to be an item class. And basically all of the functionality that's going to be inside this base class should be reusable throughout all of my other items, whether it be a consumable item, jewelry items, armor, weapons, it doesn't matter. All of them should have certain effects. So for example, you're able to drop items, so therefore it should have a droppable mesh. It should have certain item effects. For example, if it's a weapon, it should have damage. If it's a consumable item, you know, like a potion, then it should give you some life or something. And stacking options, this is just to help with the inventory. Are you able to stack that item or not, right? So some base things on my item class. Then you're going to have a base armor class, and from the armor class we're going to have other base classes such as helmets. So then all of your instances of a helmet will derive from the helmet class, so that it doesn't need to repeat any of the functionality, right? So all helmets should be equipable. All helmets will require you to specify, does it remove the hair? Does it remove the facial hair? How do you actually equip it? In what slot does it go? These will be consistent for helm classes, right? So, and for example, with armor, all of them should have a armor value associated to them, right? So that's the point of creating this hierarchy, so that there'll be less repetition of code as you're delving into the item instances, so that when you are creating the actual instance item itself, there's very little that you need to add. You basically parameterize it. You're saying use the skeletal mesh. This is the armor value for this item, so that you can really focus on the actual item instance rather than creating additional blueprints around that. So and likewise with the weapons, right? So we're going to have a weapons based class. So for example, all weapons should have damage component, right? And then you can have swords, axes, or maces. Potentially they'll have different properties like critical chances and things like that. And then you're going to create instances of swords, right? So yeah, that's the kind of structure that we're going to be following. And yeah, now we can start looking into the code. Okay, so potentially we'll get started with a base item then. So what is this base item class? So it's actually just a blueprint class, and it's of object type. So basically it's fully flexible, and it doesn't have any inheritance at all. So this is a pure object. And yeah, I've called it base item, and inside of it is essentially all of the common functions that I expect all of my items to have. So for example, all of my items I should be able to either equip or use. So what happens when I double click that item? And then what happens if I unequip the item? So this one will not necessarily be relevant to consumable items, but I may as well have it here just so that so it follows an interface. So it's not going to cause a problem in the consumables despite them not actually needing it. It will be relevant in all other cases. So, and I also specified the properties that I expect to need throughout all of my other items. So do bear in mind that you may customize this differently. So I'm integrating this with a custom server, so I need some additional parameters here like item instance IDs. So I synchronize that based on item instance ID from the server. You may not need that, so you may just directly populate the structures as you require. So for example, this item structure here contains things like item name, item descriptions, item effects, and things like that. All of my items will require a skeletal mesh, so I'm actually going to refactor this. It's again entirely up to you. I'm currently reusing this as a droppable item mesh as well as the actual mesh that I'm equipping. However, this will have its limitations, particularly when I'm coming to the armor pieces. So I will be splitting this into two meshes. One of them will be the droppable item mesh, and then the other one I'll very likely add it specifically to the armor and weapons, which is the equipped items meshes. Then we have the item owner, so this refers to the reference of the actor which is got this item. So this will be particularly useful when I'm actually doing things like equipping and unequipping the item. And then the icon that I use inside my inventory. So, you know, if I have this item in my inventory, I should represent it, and therefore I'm going to need the icon to draw in that case. So as you can see, all of these things are basically part of my base item. So this is the foundation for all of my other items. And by the way, this is the structure of the item structure. So you can see I've got item ID, item name, category, value, and the stacking options. So the category also refers to the slot in which this item is equipped to. For example, weapon, shield, armor, helm, etc. So let's have a quick look into the equip or use and then unequip item as well. So when we call the equip or use on the base item, what we're going to be doing is grabbing the item owner and looking into the variable for equipped items and then adding this item instance ID to it. Okay, so again, this is just to help with the server synchronization. So if you are creating sort of like an MMO type game and you're synchronizing with a server, perhaps you'll need to do this. If you're not, this may be not so relevant for you. But basically, when we're equipping the item, we need to keep track of it, whether that's on your own player character or the proxies that are nearby, right? So you're also synchronizing other players around you. But ultimately, Unreal Engine will need to have references of the items that each player has equipped, so it'll need to keep them somewhere, and I'm keeping them on the actor component, right? So basically I have this player character base, and inside there I have this variable of equipped items, and you can see the variable type is string to base item. So the string here refers to the item instance ID, and then the item is the base item class. Okay, so that way we're able to keep track of all of the equipped items, so that when you get a call from the server to say unequip this item, and this is the item instance ID, you'll know which one to look at in order to execute that function. So in a very similar fashion, when you call unequip inside the base item, which is going to be reusing this function, basically grabbing the item owner, taking the equipped items, and then removing this item instance ID from that map so that we stop tracking that item after we unequip it. So yeah, basically this will work as a sort of waterfall from your item classes. We'll see this shortly, but basically when you have your sword instance, the sword will call its parent, and then that parent will call its own parent, and ultimately it will bubble down to the base class. And this is what I'm saying in terms of reusing our blueprints, so we don't need to repeat this logic in the other instances. Okay, so let's look at the next class. Okay, so perhaps the next thing that we'll look at are weapons, because I believe they're slightly easier than armor, so we'll see why soon. And basically in weapons, we still have the same functions that we had before. We actually override them. We'll look into those shortly. Before I jump into those, let's explore the variables that we introduce in this base class. So the first two that we see here are main hand slot and offhand slot. So what are those? These simply specify where does the weapon go when you equip it. So basically they go in your hands, right? So we'll be able to clearly see that if we look into our player character base. And inside here, we're going to have some sockets for your weapons. So for example, your main hand will be the socket weapon right, and then your offhand is the socket weapon left. So basically, this is where the skeleton mesh will go if you equip that sword. Okay, so in order to dynamically find it, what I've done is I've added some tags to these components. So you're able to add tags to your skeletal meshes. And here mine is called weapon left on the socket weapon left and weapon right on the socket weapon right. So this will allow me to dynamically find these sockets regardless of the blueprint that I pass to it. So whether it's my own character or the proxies on the screen, I'm always going to be able to grab the reference to that character blueprint, and then I'm going to seek for these tags. So I'm going to search for skeletal meshes with these tags in order to find the correct sockets. So that's what these sockets refer to, and you can see that I've specified them here. So that means when I create my actual weapon instances, I'm not going to need to actually populate them again because it's already predefined in my base classes. Okay, so that's main hand slot and the offhand slot. So let's have a look at the other ones. So one-handed refers to whether the weapon that we have is one-handed or two-handed. So we override this inside our weapon instances. So when you actually create your class, will override this, and this will be useful for determining what kind of animations to play, or like how does the character hold that weapon and things like that. Okay, so let's see what happens when we equip or use the base melee weapon. Let's see how we leverage these variables when doing so. So when we call it in the base melee weapon, the first thing we do is we call the parent, which will basically add the item to this variable item. So we grab the item owner, we put this item into the equipped items, so that's what we do there, and then we take the slot name and we check, is it equipped to the shield or the weapon, which is basically main hand or offhand. So you can see I'm creating this variable. This is potentially not necessary, but anyway, we basically define the weapon slot we used, either in main hand slot or the offhand slot, and then we're going to look for that component, right? So we're able to grab the item owner, which is this player character base blueprint. We get component by tag, and the tag name are these slot, right? So either main hand slot or the offhand slot. So we basically get components by tag and we reference that name, and then we're supposed to get just one instance of this element. So for each one of those, we grab that component and then we basically say set skinned asset and update, and we specify the skeletal mesh that we define in the subsequent classes, right? So basically when we get down to our actual melee weapon, we'll define what this skeletal mesh looks like, because at the moment we've not actually set it, and we essentially update what that component will look like in this particular blueprint. And that means we don't need to repeat this logic in our other blueprints. We just reuse this one in the other places. And let's have a look what unequip does. It will do something very similar, but basically the opposite. So we grab our item owner. We've updated what the weapon slot is based on the previous equip. So we find that tag again, and then we simply update the skinned asset and update with no new mesh defined. So this simply removes that item. So do bear in mind that we could actually add additional steps here in both of these functions, where we say use these animations to equip or unequip it. So you could be sheathing your sword or putting it away, or likewise just pulling it out of somewhere. So you'll be able to add this kind of logic in these places, because we'll basically embed those animations here as well. So this could become a lot more complex as you require, but it will be isolated logic that could be reused in all of your other blueprints as well. Okay, so the next thing that we'll look at is this sword weapon base, but actually I haven't included any additional logic here. So this is just simply to represent that we can have other base classes to embed additional logic that may be required. So you'll be able to see that the parent class here is the base melee weapon. You can also see that I'm pulling the defaults from the base melee weapon, so these have already been defined inside the base class. But everything else is kept as is. So later on, I'll be able to basically open the blueprint and I'll be able to add additional logic here. So for example, here, I'll be able to override equip or use. Potentially, I'll be able to specify different defaults for the animations if I want my swords to look and feel different to axes or something like that as well, right? So I'll be able to customize it as I wish through additional base classes. So at the moment, like I say, I didn't need to add any additional customization here. So what I'm going to do is jump directly into an implementation for a one-handed sword. So let's have a look at that. So inside the sword instance, right, so basically this is now an actual item instance. You can see that I'm starting to populate the variables for this item. So as you can see, I haven't actually added any modifications to any blueprints, and this is because I don't need to. I just need to parameterize the blueprints that are the base classes, right? So for instance, this sword will be equipped to weapon right if it's inside the main hand weapon, weapon left if it's on the offhand weapon, and I didn't actually need to override them. Like this by default will be populated when I create an instance, and I'll demonstrate that shortly. I can populate these default values as well. If you're not synchronizing with a server, you can do that. For me, I'm actually pulling this information from the server, so this can be left blank. I've simply populated it here for representation. This item is one-handed, so I can tick that box. Later on, I'll be able to override these animations if I want to, but actually they'll be embedded inside either the base melee weapon or the sword base class. So I won't even need to modify them here. But, you know, if you have specific cash shop items or like some premium items that you want to look and feel different, perhaps, you know, you have an item that you obtain from a boss and it's some sort of a special sword which you want to have different animations to, you'll have the flexibility here to override what that item looks and feels like. So it will give you a lot more flexibility with that. And yeah, I'll also be able to specify the skeletal mesh. So as I mentioned, at the moment, I'm reusing this same mesh for when I'm dropping the item, as well as when I'm equipping the item. And I can also specify the icon to use when it's equipped in my inventory. So as you can see, all of these are just simply parameterized so that I don't need to add any additional blueprints when I'm creating these item instances. And I'll be able to sort of demonstrate that again now. So what we'll do then is we'll create a new item instance and we'll just create it with a sword base class, right? So at the moment, actually my sun sword is off the base melee weapon because it didn't actually matter whether I created it off a sword weapon base. But let's do it properly. Like we'll create it based off the sword weapon base. We'll call it sword 2. And let's see what happens inside. So inside you can see the defaults are already created based on my base classes, right? So you can see the main hand slot is already populated with weapon right, offhand populated with weapon left, so this is as expected. So the animations would also be populated with the defaults. At the moment, I didn't really just add anything here. You can even see that the category is pre-selected to weapon as well. So in my case, like I say, this item object will be synchronized with the server, so I don't need to populate it. But if you are just basically doing a single player game, for instance, or you've got the flexibility to just populate this yourself, you can do so. We'll just call it a sword two-handed weapon or something. And then we're able to specify the skeletal mesh for this weapon. So for example, you might have bought some new assets. So let's see, we've got this two-handed weapon, and let's see if we've got something over here as well. So we can create a icon for this weapon as well. So I can use one of these, and there we have it. So I would have basically created a new instance of a weapon just by creating these parameters. So it should become really easy in the future to create new items because all of the work is already carried out by the base classes. So we just need to simply parameterize the items that we have. So this is almost like a framework to dealing with items in our game. So that's what we're trying to achieve here. And yeah, we'll be able to have a look at how this works in practice. So I can go ahead and delete this. Before I go into another demo, perhaps I'll go through the armor items, and then we can have a look at the demo, and I'll basically be referencing where each of the parameters are used. Okay, so let's have a look at armor now then. So we're going to have a look at two different base classes. So the first one is the armor base, and then we'll also have a look at the helmet base. And I haven't actually created the bases for like the chest piece, boots, and other pieces as well, right? So at the moment we'll just focus on the helmet, but they'll follow the same convention. So you'll sort of understand why shortly. So the first thing that we want to have a look at is that we again have the two commonalities here. So equip or use or unequip item. There's a new function for getting slots to meshes, and we'll see how that's used shortly. And the new variable that's introduced in the armor is this slots to component. So in our weapons base class, we had these main hand slot or offhand slot, but the armor is a little bit more complex. So it can have multiple different slots, and it can really depend on the type of armor that you're equipping. So this is quite dynamic. So that's why we have a variable defined, which will customize all of the different options that we can have available. So the key for here is this race gender key. So why do we have that race gender key? Is because your armor will appear differently depending on the race or the gender of your character. So for instance, you can have, let's say, a plate mail that you're equipping onto your character. That plate mail will look differently depending on whether it's a human or an orc equipping that item. And likewise, even if it's a human, you can have a male or a female. So you could be using different meshes for the same item depending on the race or the gender of your character. So you can see that this becomes sort of explosively more difficult to maintain depending on the variations that you allow inside your game. So for instance, if you have 5 different races and 2 different genders on each one, you're going to have a lot of different options that you will need to account for when it comes to your items. So this can be a little bit difficult to maintain. So do bear that in mind when determining how much flexibility you want to have in your game. So yeah, let's have a look at what the definitions of these are. Okay, so let's have a look at the first one. So that was race gender pair. So this is simply a string of race and string for gender. And both of these combined will be a key for us to use to identify which material and skeletal mesh to use. So let's have a look at this again. So we have race gender pair, and it maps to slots to mesh material. So let's have a look at slots to mesh materials. And this structure is the slots. So that's your key here, which is the string. And the string refers to, again, one of these slots over here. So basically, let's say there should be something for helmet, for instance. So there's helmet over there. So you can see that this component has a helm tag. So that way we'll be able to identify it as a helm. And the component here is mesh material. So let's have a look at that one as well. So mesh material struct. And here we basically have the skeletal mesh, and then again a key of, a map of material instances. Okay, so basically we can have multiple materials applied to one skeletal mesh, and I will demonstrate where that is the case. So if we go back to the armor base and we have a look at the equip or use, let's see how we're going to be utilizing these variables here. So all of these armors will have a common way of equipping them. It's a complex way, but it is a common way. So the first thing that we'll do is we'll call our parent, which will add this item to our equipped items variable so that we have a record of it. We then grab slots to meshes. Okay, so we're going to be calling this function over here. What this does is it grabs our item owner. So this is the character that we're playing with. It has this variable for appearance structure, which contains the race and the gender for our character. So with that, we can generate this key in order to find the relevant details from this slots to variable, right? So from here, we're able to extract the slots to mesh materials, which basically includes the skeletal mesh and the materials associated to that skeletal mesh as well. And then we return it. So here we come back and now we have the relevant slots and the mesh materials that we need to apply to our character. So we just promote it to a variable, and for each one we go through and we grab the key first. Okay, so we basically iterate over all of the keys. The keys refer to the slots. What does the slot refer to? It's the slot for the component that we pull from this structure over here. So why is it a map anyway? Like the reason is because some items will require more than one slot. Okay, so for instance, imagine we have gloves. Gloves could have more than one component that it impacts. So it can impact the way your hands look, and then it will also add another hands add component, right? So you can have as many as 3, 4, it doesn't really matter. Basically, an item can update multiple components at one time, at least with armor pieces. So that's why we're going to need a map of slots to meshes. Okay, so for instance, with gloves, it will have one component for hands and another component for hands add, and it will have 2 separate skeletal meshes that it will add when you equip that item. Okay, so let's go back to the equip or use. So as you can see here, we're going to be iterating over each one of the keys here, which refer to the tag name. And we essentially look for the tag, we grab the skeletal mesh component, so we grab the actual component from here, and then we're going to be updating its skeletal mesh asset. So what do we update it with? Well, we also get ourselves the slots to mesh materials from this part over here, and we basically obtain the skeletal mesh and the materials based on the slot that we're currently on. So it's a little bit complicated here, but this complexity is kind of necessary when dealing with such a dynamic range of items. Okay, so basically here we're able to extract the skeletal mesh and the material instances associated to that skeletal mesh. So we update the skeletal mesh asset, and then we iterate over each of the material instances, updating those as well. So you can see we're updating the material by name, and this is a map of material name to the material instance. I'll show you what they are now. So let's have a look. So for example, SK hue. So these are the random items that I may be able to equip. So if I go into any one of these, you can see here the material slots are associated to your skeletal meshes. And here we have one material slot. In many instances, it's actually just going to be the one, but there will be some which will have more than one material slot. So really this is to make sure that it's future-proof, because if you come across the items which will require more than one material slot in the future, it'll be very difficult for you to update it later on. So it's better to just make a system which will be able to account for more than one material instance for your items. So that's why it looks a little bit more complicated than usual, right? Because otherwise, like I say, you could just simply pass the skeletal mesh. You could even forget about material instances. But if you want that extra optimization that you can make, then you will also basically specify the different material instances, the material instance names, and update those manually as well. So this could be very useful later on. In terms of unequipping items, I think, yeah, at the moment, my logic lives inside the helmet class. I'll bring it over here. I'll show you what I've got so far. I will be moving the majority of it here, but there will be some custom logic that will need to stay there as well. So let's have a look at what the helmet base class looks like. So let's have a look at what the helmet base does. So specifically, let's see the equip or use or unequip items. So when I'm equipping a helmet, I need it to do everything that the armor base has done, but I'm also going to need to do two additional things. The first one is process the removal of hair where necessary, and process the removal of facial hair where necessary. So you can see I've created two extra booleans to track whether these items need to remove that hair, and it's only relevant to helmets, right? So I don't need these booleans to exist on my chest piece or my boots and things like that. So that's why I have specific base classes for these structures. So okay, let's have a look at what happens when I want to process remove hair. So basically, if this boolean is true, I mean, to be honest, I can reuse it here instead of this new visibility, but hey, if my remove hair is true, my visibility is actually false here. So I go ahead and search for my component by tag. The tag that I'm searching for is hair. So if I look here, there's my player character base, there's my hair component, and I have a tag hair on that component. So that's how I'm able to find it. And then I get myself that component and I set its visibility to the new visibility, okay, which is basically the inverse of remove hair. And the same thing for process remove hair, like literally the exact same thing, but the tag that I'm looking for is a different tag. So I could look to refactor that, but you know, just for extra visibility, I can see what it's doing. I basically grab myself the component to represent the facial hair here, and I update the visibility as necessary. So you can see the actual equipping of the helmet happens inside the armor base, but then my helmet will also need to do some additional processing, which is handled here. And let's have a look at the unequipped item. So at the moment, this helmet base will handle the unequip of the helmet entirely. And what I do is I basically grab my facial hair and I make sure that it's visible. This is regardless of whether it was invisible or visible before. I grab my hair component, I make sure that's visible. I then grab the helm component and I remove the mesh from it. Okay, so when I unequip this helmet, I simply reset these components to what they should be. Okay, so I remove the helmet and I make sure that the hair is visible. Okay, and that's basically it from the helmet base. So we'll be able to have a look at the actual instance of the item now. Okay, so now let's have a look at the actual helmet instance. So this one is called Footman's Helmet, and let's see what's inside there. So again, as you can see, I haven't modified any of the blueprints because all I need to do is define the parameters for this item. So for instance, I need this item to remove the hair. It doesn't need to remove the facial hair, they can stay as is. I've also created some elements here for my race gender. So for example, right now I was playing with a DK male, and I need to basically specify that this helmet will go into the helm slot, and the material instances that I need to use is M Footman's Helmet, and then this is the skeletal mesh. Okay, so I'll be able to show you shortly how to add additional parameters for your different variants, and let's have a look at the other items for now. So again, from the item base, I have this item structure, so I've specified the item ID, item name, and things like that. I've got this skeletal mesh to use for my helmet. So this is, again, the droppable item skeletal mesh, as well as the actual skeletal mesh you use when you equip that item. And here's the icon that I use to represent this item in my inventory. Okay, so this is now a fully fledged item that I can use, at least for my DK class with male gender. So you can also see that I've only got the one race gender key predefined here. So let's see what happens if I'm trying to log in with a different one and it doesn't have that defined. So basically, let's go into this character. What I'll do is I'll drop this item. So I'll be able to right click and drop this item, and I'm going to perhaps create a new character. So should we do human female, so character 3. This will be pretty good example of where, you know, you'll need different skeletal meshes, different materials for different items. So the item was dropped around here, so let's pick it up. I need to remember how to pick up. Okay. And if I equip it, nothing happens, right? Because it's not actually defined. That map of data is missing, so it basically doesn't really do anything. So let's see what happens after we add that in. Okay, so let's have a look at how we'd add support for the new race gender pair. So what I'll do is I'll add a new entry here. We need to specify the race, so it'll be human, gender is female, and let's populate these items as well. So this will go into the same slot, it's a helm slot, and inside there we can specify the skeletal mesh. So in our case, this one is human male helm footman, so here it's going to be human female helm footman. And of course you can actually choose whatever skeletal meshes you like. It could even look completely different. For the helmet, I think they basically look the same, but there'll be more obvious changes for, you know, chest pieces and things like that, right? So let's have a look at the next part. So how do you actually find the material instance name to use? In fact, I'll show you that here. So you can identify the skeletal mesh that you're using here. And this is actually the slot name that's required for that material. So you can copy the slot name from here and you can paste it in. So that's how you find the slot name for the material. And in our case, it's actually the same one as well. So it's mi helmet footman go. So let's type that in as well. So be footman. And okay, so that should actually do the trick. So let's compile and let's try that. So we'll go into here, we'll click play, we'll go into our character, and there it is. So now we've got a helmet equipped on a human female character. One thing I forgot to disable is this thing. So we want to remove hair when we're equipping this item. So let's compile that in. Let's go back in. And now it should work as expected. So as you can see, the more customizations you want to add, the more complex this logic becomes. But all of the logic gets embedded into these base classes, so you don't need to re-implement it on item instances. We just need to parameterize it and reuse that logic. One of the last things I wanted to cover is how we'd go about finding the correct item references to use. So basically you have an item ID and you then want to know which base class or which item class to use. So I've used data tables for that, so you can create them through miscellaneous data table, and then you can specify the row structure to use in here. So I've created one called item data table structure. So let's have a look at what that looks like. So item data table structure. So all it has is the item class. Okay, like it's literally the base item class definition. And let's have a look what's inside that. So basically this data table, you can specify a row name. So in my case, I'm using my ID. This ID is actually passed from my server. You can use whatever you like here. So I would suggest using an ID because it'll be easier to work with. And then you basically create new entries, right, for each of your new weapons. Okay, so I have one for the weapons and I want to keep it separate from my armor. So for example, in the armor, I also have another data table and I specify the class name. So you can see here, my ID of 1505 points to this footman helmet class, and that way I'll be able to reference that class. I'll show you how to use that in a moment. So I've also got this blueprint for item finder. This is just to refactor how I find these items through my other code. So for example, I'm able to find item by ID and category. So if I'm looking for a weapon, I'm going to be searching in the weapon table. So get data table row weapon DS, and I specify the ID inside here. So basically that is the row name, and I grab myself the item class, and that's how I pass it back. Okay, so at the moment I've just got the separation for the weapon, or the default, which looks through all of the armor pieces. But again, you can customize it as you like. But this way I'm able to basically find the correct item classes to use based on an ID. The last thing I wanted to do is just loop this back to my custom server. So how do I actually go ahead and execute this function? So I actually get a request from my server to tell me that I need to equip an item, right? So whether that's for my character or a different character, it actually specifies the name. So you'll be able to see that my message from the server says, this is the player name and they need to equip these items. So then based on whether that's my actual character or my proxies, I decide whether I call this function or this one. Don't worry too much about the details here because they are in the document, so check that out. I'm just going to go through one example here. So if it's my character, I'm going to basically call into here, and I'm going to grab the equipped items that my server tells I need to equip. And there's a couple of things I need to do. So first of all, I have the equipped items widget. I need to update it with the newly equipped items. Next, I need to tell my character capture blueprint to update. So this is my inventory component. I'll just very quickly show you which one that is. So if I go into here, it's this one over here, so you'll be able to see that this character, like the female representing this one over here, also has the helmet equipped. So that one's making sure that the character capture inside my inventory widget is updated. And next, I'm telling my actual player character to also equip items to the mesh. So let's have a look at what that does. So it goes through each of the equipped items because my server can tell me to equip multiple items at once. And for each one, I'm going to be calling this function. So here, I go through each of the equipped item, which contains the item instance ID and the category. I then find the item by ID and category. This is the one that we just looked through earlier, which is looking through the data tables to find the base item. Now, bear in mind that the class here refers to the actual instance. So, for example, it's talking about the footman's helmet or the sun sword. So even though I say construct base item, it's actually constructing the full-fledged item. And I'm using the base item as an interface to equip or unequip those items. So this is a pretty important thing to remember. I specify the player reference. So, for example, here, this is my own player. So I specify this particular actor as the player reference, and the item owner as well. So I've constructed the base item, and then I tell that item to go ahead and execute the equip or use. Okay, so if this is a footman's helmet, I'm telling the footman's helmet class to equip or use that item, and it will go through each of the relevant base classes to execute that functionality as well. Okay, so this was a relatively long one. I hope that made sense. Do ask questions. This is a pretty complicated subject and it will grow, right? So for example, in the near future, I'll be looking at optimizing the weapons, putting in some extra animations in there, really customizing that further. So there'll be really interesting stuff coming ahead there. And yeah, hopefully I'll be working on the combat features very soon as well. But anyway, best of luck, and again, find all of the relevant steps in the document. So if there's anything missing in that post, do let me know. I'll look to make the amends. So yeah, best of luck and see you next time. Thanks. Bye.